In just 10 minutes, unlock 10 shocking takeaways from Eliot Cohen and Eric Edelman's explosive interview with economic warfare expert Edward Fishman on the Bulwark, Shield of the Republic. Discover how the U.S. uses the dollar as a weapon, why Japan really attacked us, and why sanctions on Iran, Russia, and China may backfire. Strategy, power, lies, and global consequences. This one pulls no punches. Takeaway 1. America's economic power is weaponized. The United States has developed an unmatched dominance in the global financial system by turning the dollar into a weapon of economic statecraft. The podcast discusses how this dominance grew even as America's share of global GDP dropped from about 60% after World War II to just 25% in recent decades. This shift happened because of liberalization in the 1970s, the explosion of offshore dollar markets, and deals like the one where the U.S. promised Saudi Arabia military support in exchange for reinvesting oil revenue back into U.S. treasuries. The result is a system where 90% of foreign exchange transactions worldwide involve the U.S. dollar, even though the U.S. only accounts for about 10% of global trade. This allows America to control access to the world's most important currency with just the stroke of a pen. Edward Fishman calls this the single most powerful economic choke point in modern history. For example, when the U.S. sanctioned a small bank in Macau that did business with North Korea, the shockwaves crippled North Korea's entire access to global banking because every institution feared being cut off from the U.S. dollar system. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 2, sanctions have become America's first strike. The U.S. increasingly turns to economic sanctions as its go-to foreign policy weapon, often instead of using military force. Since the early 2000s, and especially after the failures of Iraq and Afghanistan, there has been a deep reluctance among American policymakers to use military options. Sanctions are now seen as the middle ground, a way to exert pressure without sending troops. But while these tools might seem less harmful, they can still cause devastating effects. Fishman describes sanctions as the foremost tool in modern conflicts. The U.S. has used them to cripple enemy economies, cut off tech transfers, freeze assets, and isolate nations diplomatically. The power to do this usually sits in the Treasury Department, where a handful of officials can shut down access to global finance. For example, in 2014, after Russia invaded Crimea, the U.S. chose sanctions over arming Ukraine. While this move avoided war, it also let Russia believe the West would never escalate beyond financial tools. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 3, export controls are a new weapon. America is now using its dominance in high-end technology to cut off rivals from the tools they need to build modern economies. The podcast highlights how semiconductors are now one of the most powerful tools in economic warfare. U.S. firms contribute over 40% to the global semiconductor value chain. They control chip design, chip-making tools, and the patents that underpin cutting-edge tech. This dominance allows the U.S. to ban companies from buying American-designed parts, even if those parts are produced overseas. The Trump administration first used this against Huawei, and the Biden administration expanded it to cover the entire Chinese economy. Fishman calls it the tech version of secondary sanctions. For example, Taiwanese chipmaker TSMC was told they could either make chips for Huawei or do business with American suppliers. They chose America, cutting Huawei off at the knees. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 4, American overreach can backfire dangerously. One of the most controversial discussions in the episode revolves around how American sanctions have sometimes led not to peace, but to war. The hosts mentioned Thomas Jefferson's Embargo Act and how it hurt American merchants more than Britain or France. But more dangerously, they discuss how the U.S. oil embargo against Japan in 1941 arguably led to the Pearl Harbor attack. Cutting Japan off from oil forced them to consider military conquest in Southeast Asia. Similarly, today's heavy-handed sanctions could push modern authoritarian regimes into confrontation. Edward Fishman warns that if we don't use economic warfare wisely, it's only a matter of time before it kind of bridges us into real shooting wars. For example, China is building parallel financial systems and alternative supply chains, precisely because they fear being targeted next. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 5, deterrence through sanctions is often a myth. Sanctions rarely stop determined adversaries. The podcast looks at how sanctions were used before Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine with the hope of stopping it. They failed. Vladimir Putin was not deterred, and instead he launched a full-scale invasion. Similarly, North Korea's nuclear ambitions were not slowed by economic pressure, and Iran's regime remains committed to its goals despite years of sanctions. Eliot Cohen puts it bluntly when he says, "I just don't think tightening the economic thumbscrews is going to get the deal you want. Not on something of first-order importance and not with a hard authoritarian regime." For example, when the U.S. slapped banking restrictions on North Korea, they did suffer, but Kim Jong-un did not abandon his weapons program. He doubled down instead. We're halfway through the video. Thanks for sticking with us. If you're enjoying it, hit the thumbs up and share it in your WhatsApp groups. If you'd like to support us, please tap the thanks button below. It helps us keep making great content. Drop a comment and don't forget to hit subscribe for more. Now let's continue with the video. Takeaway 6. Sanctions can hit allies harder than enemies. A darker side of economic warfare is when the U.S. targets allies or neutral countries with the same aggressive tactics. Under Trump, tariffs and sanctions were used not just against adversaries like China or Iran, but against Canada, Mexico, and Europe. Allies were sanctioned for buying Iranian oil or for not complying with U.S. tech restrictions. This created a global backlash and made even friendly nations start questioning their dependence on the U.S. dollar system. Fishman says that every country, including places like Brazil and Vietnam, started asking how they could escape this American chokehold. For example, Europe tried to set up its own financial channel called INSTEX to trade with Iran and bypass the dollar entirely. It failed, but the very attempt signaled growing discomfort. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 7. Authoritarian regimes adapt faster than expected. Despite initial pain, countries like Iran, Russia, and North Korea have learned to adapt to economic pressure. Fishman explains that sanctions cause immediate recessions, but over time, these regimes find new ways to survive. Russia, for example, faced a 10% economic contraction in 2014, but bounced back by shifting trade to Asia and investing in domestic production. Iran suffered a sharp drop in oil sales, yet found back channels through places like China. North Korea uses cybercrime and illicit smuggling to keep funds flowing. This makes long-term sanctions harder to sustain and less effective. For example, after the U.S. imposed maximum pressure on Iran in 2018, the Iranian economy took a hit, but within 2 years it had already started to recover, even before Biden took office. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 8. Pressure without off-ramps leads nowhere. One major failure of U.S. sanctions policy, as discussed in the podcast, is the lack of an off-ramp for adversaries. If a country is punished with no clear path to redemption, then sanctions become tools of punishment, not diplomacy. This happened during the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign on Iran. Even when public protests erupted in Iran, there was no deal on the table, no negotiation channel, and no visible reward for changing behavior. As a result, the Iranian regime just dug in deeper. Fishman says that sanctions need to be tied to a strategy. Otherwise, they lose meaning. For example, during Obama's time, Iran agreed to reduce its nuclear program in exchange for easing sanctions. That kind of deal disappeared under Trump, leaving Iran with no incentive to comply. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 9. The U.S. risks losing its dollar privilege. The podcast ends with a bleak warning. America's dominance in the financial system is not guaranteed forever. Fishman says that if the dollar stops being the world's safe haven currency, the entire system of economic warfare could collapse. Trump's actions, like threatening to fire the Federal Reserve Chair and sanctioning friendly nations, have already damaged trust in the dollar. If countries lose faith in U.S. stability, they will seek alternatives. The euro, for example, has started gaining ground, and China is promoting its currency in regional trade. If the world no longer sees U.S. debt as safe, then America may be forced to raise taxes or cut spending. For example, if Japan or China stopped buying U.S. treasuries, the U.S. would lose one of its main ways to finance its government and foreign policy. Now let's move to the last takeaway. Takeaway 10. Chokepoints are reshaping global power. Edward Fishman's book, Chokepoints, is not just a policy analysis. It is a warning about how a few hidden levers in the global economy can shape world events. These choke points, whether the dollar, semiconductors, or critical minerals, give the U.S. tremendous power, but also create fragile dependencies. Fishman argues that unless these tools are used with precision and restraint, they will provoke retaliation and possibly even war. He shares how just a few technocrats in the Treasury Department can shut down entire industries abroad, often without debate. For example, when Chinese telecom giant ZTE was sanctioned, it nearly went bankrupt overnight, showing how one move in Washington can trigger global chaos. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to support this channel, hit the thanks button below. It really helps us keep going. If you enjoyed this summary, please leave a like and share it in your WhatsApp groups. To join discussion about this video, drop a comment below. And for more videos like this, hit the subscribe button below.